Everybody loves a trope. And if you're a fan of horror movies, whether it's the classic stuff from like the 1950s and 60s, my wife and I are big fans of those, to the more of the psychological, some of the weird horror stuff that came out in the 70s, and to the slasher films of the 80s and 90s, or if you're in the torture porn of the 20th century, 21st century, people just enjoy horror movies, and horror movies are rife with tropes. And one of the most famous tropes is that something is haunted because the place was built on X, Y, or Z. And it's almost always a Native American burial ground. You built this structure on a Native American burial ground. Or poltergeist, you moved the headstones but not the bodies kind of thing. But the whole you built this on a Native American burial ground has become a trope. But it isn't a trope. Not for America. For America, it's reality. Because the entire continent, from sea to shining sea, is one vast Native American burial ground. Because the European invaders very intentionally tried to wipe out the people that lived here. And when they failed to wipe out them physically, they attempted to wipe them out culturally, banning their languages and their dance, taking their children away from them and punishing those children if they spoke their indigenous languages, made them cut their hair, made them wear Western clothing, made them act and talk like Europeans in an attempt to erase the culture and the people that existed here for anywhere between 15 to 30,000 years before the Europeans arrived. So if you ever think that, we're having bad times right now and would like an excuse to explain them, well, maybe you can explain it away by using the trope, well, maybe we shouldn't have built America on a Native American burial ground. Because we shouldn't have. I am still of the firm belief that Europeans should never have come here. That we had no right to invade this land. They weren't ours. Now, many of the Native Americans that lived here were willing to share because they did not view ownership in the way that the Europeans viewed ownership. One of the things that you'll often hear talk about is like, oh, the foolish Indians that sold Manhattan for beads. Well, the beads they were trading were real trade goods. They were valuable to those people. They were better than currency because they didn't really have a need for the currency of Europe, but those beads, they were useful to them artistically and religiously. But they weren't selling them the land they were standing on. In fact, if anything, the Native Americans were conning the Europeans because the Native Americans that they gave the beads to didn't own that land. As far as those Native Americans were concerned, they were probably you're just paying us to come use it. Because using a piece of land was acceptable. You came in and used it this time of the year, someone else comes in and uses it another time of the year, people are moving and going back and forth, they're ranging up one area from one area of the coast down to another area of the coast, they're moving around. Shells that were harvested in the Gulf of Mexico end up in Canada. How? They get traded from place to place to place because people are moving constantly all over the place, encountering, mixing, mingling, selling, trading. It was a dynamic culture that didn't view ownership the way Europeans did. No, I know I don't have every detail of this nailed down. I'm not an expert. But I have a much better grasp of it than most Americans seem to. I know that Europeans invaded this continent. And when my ancestors showed up here, Europeans have been in control for a really long time. Because my folks came through Ellis Island. My ancestors came through Ellis Island. So America had been long established by the time my family showed up. But that doesn't change the fact that where my house is built used to belong to somebody else. And Europeans came in and displaced them. Sometimes through sheer force, and sometimes through just killing them. By taking things away from them that they used. By taking away their traditional areas where they came to fish every year, or came to plant every year, or they might winter, or they might summer. They say, no, you can't do that here anymore because we own it now. And so many Americans seem to be completely ignorant of that fact. Because white supremacy teaches us to be ignorant of those facts. And that's one of the problems that many Americans have. They know so little that when it's introduced to them, it sounds so foreign that they can't or won't accept it. And when part of their brain begins to realize that, yes, in fact, that piece of information you've been told is the truth, that runs counter to the narrative they've been raised on, so they're just not going to listen to it. And they just dig their heels in and become even more defensive. But we stole this continent. We tried to kill the people who lived here. We succeeded in some cases. There are numerous Native American cultures which are just gone. We wiped out hundreds of languages in South America, Europeans did. We displaced Native Americans from this area, shoving them into little reservations dotted all over the place, sometimes hundreds of miles away from their traditional areas where their ancestors roamed. Because Europeans said, no, we own this now. And they ignored the traditions that were already here. And they built their houses. They really didn't care if they were building them on graveyards or just on piles of corpses.